Welcome to a presentation from the Academic Writing Program at the University of Maryland. I'm Katie D'Angelo, a lecturer in the Academic Writing Program. This presentation will provide you with a number of strategies for integrating sources into your writing. Now that you've identified a research topic, found a variety of sources that address issues on all sides of this topic, and identified the particular sources that most inform your own argument, you'll need to think about how and when you should bring those sources into your paper. This presentation will help you see that responding to your sources is the next step in the research process. When you're developing any research project, finding good sources is only the first part. What you do with those sources is the second step, and your techniques will contribute to the overall effectiveness of your argument. Before we start, I invite you to think about the ways you've already used sources in your papers in the past. In your previous writing, did you bring in sources to support the view you were arguing? Did you defer to your sources because they were the experts? Did you let your sources make the key points of the essay, rather than relying on your own knowledge of the issue? Although none of these techniques are technically wrong, they're also not the only ways you can use sources in your paper. So what are the downsides of looking only at sources on one side of the argument? When you do this, you don't give the reader a sense of the full debate around the topic. And when you defer too much to your sources and you let them voice more of the evidence than you do, you might inadvertently be hurting your own credibility as a speaker by not presenting your own ideas on the topic and elevating yourself as a knowledgeable participant in the debate. You might also be simply summarizing other people's points rather than developing an argument of your own. So although these techniques may work in many situations, you also want to expand your repertoire of strategies for bringing sources into your papers. In the remainder of this presentation, I will outline several strategies you may use and provide examples of how these strategies might look on paper. The first strategy is to complicate your research from the beginning. When you begin with open-ended inquiry, you look for research representing a variety of perspectives. What are the benefits here? You have increased knowledge of the topic and better understanding of the academic conversations, so it'll be easier for you to start writing. The second strategy is to use sources you don't necessarily agree with. You don't have to only bring in sources that you agree with. In fact, you'll strengthen your own claims by arguing against alternative points of view. Other benefits are that you'll make your argument more concrete by establishing it against a specific idea or claim on the other side. And you'll also put your argument in the context with some larger debate. The third strategy is to introduce your sources effectively. When you drop in a quote without introducing it, your reader might not know how to respond to that information. They might be thinking, where did this come from? Is the source even credible? The reader might be skeptical about the evidence you're presenting and thus not as easily persuaded. Instead, introduce the source, and if you have additional information about the writer, emphasize the source's expertise on the topic. This strategy will work more effectively for academic sources where the writer is an expert rather than popular sources where the writer is a journalist. The benefits here are that before the reader gets to the quoted material, he or she will already see the importance of that information, and they may be more inclined to view this material as credible and valid. The next strategy is to summarize your sources and put the information in context. Provide some context for the source itself. Since any quote or paraphrase that you bring in is only going to reflect a piece of what the original source said, you may need to give some more background. Did it come from a larger study? Is it only one aspect of the source's conclusions? You may not need to summarize everything about that source's argument, but a one-sentence summary will help your reader become grounded in their point of view. The benefits here are that the reader will have enough background on the quoted material to understand where the quote fits in. And you can craft the summary to emphasize the elements that relate back to your argument. The next strategy is to use your sources to complicate the issue. Here, you can use your source's ideas as something other than support for the argument. In fact, you might deliberately include a problematic quote because it helps to illustrate certain questions that still need to be explored, or because it demonstrates some complicated and unresolved aspect of the argument. You can also begin to break down particular logical fallacies or questions that your source uses and analyze where the logic doesn't add up. The next strategy is to feel free to both agree and disagree with your source. Don't hesitate to include a source that makes valuable points, but that you agree with on some level. Present the material and go on to analyze both what the source has right and what he or she has wrong. The benefits here are that you show yourself to be open-minded and balanced because you can acknowledge strong points on the other side, and the strategy also allows you to distinguish your own ideas from what has been said before, and may allow you to carve out a middle or bridge position between alternative points of view. 7 strategies to vary your use of quotes and paraphrase material. Consider how much of your source material needs to be presented as a direct quote. Most likely, it's much less than you think. Reserve direct quotes only for the material that must be said in the exact words of the source. If the speaker has particular expertise or strong opinion, or if his or her contribution may then need to be preserved in quoted form. However, there are likely long pieces of text that could be paraphrased. Remember, paraphrase material, like quoted material, must be followed with an in-text citation. But by paraphrasing the source's idea, you're putting that content into your own words and pulling out the aspect of the author's view that you think are significant. When you do use direct quotes, vary your style to include a combination of full quotes introduced with a complete sentence, block quotes indented 1 inch for quotes that are 4 lines or longer, and fragmented quotes that are embedded directly into your sentence. The benefits of paraphrasing are that you're not turning over too much of the paper to the voice of your sources. When you paraphrase a material, you're still presenting that information from a source, but you're doing so through your own interpretation of it. And by using direct quotes more sparingly, the quotes that you do include will have more of an impact. And the last strategy is that you want to analyze your source's material sufficiently. One of the biggest mistakes you can make in presenting source material is to assume that your quotes speak for themselves. In fact, readers will often need some help in interpreting that material, not only to understand what it says, but also to see how it relates to your specific argument. Whenever you include material from an outside source, plan to spend several sentences analyzing that information. Your analysis may address what the quote says, particularly for complicated quotes that might need some unpacking, what parts of the quote are most significant, and how this material serves as support for your views or how it reflects ideas that you intend to refute. A good rule of thumb here is that your analysis should always be longer than the quote itself. When you look at your paragraphs, you should see much more of your voice than that of your sources. The benefits of analysis is that you'll keep your reader aligned with your point of view throughout the essay, despite the variety of interesting and complicated ideas you bring in from outside sources. Here, each time the reader encounters a new point or a new idea, he or she will see exactly how it relates to the argument that you're making in the essay. And in your analysis, you can put your sources in conversation with each other. When you bring in a new source, relate it back to the ideas of a source you used earlier in your essay. Point out the areas where the sources agree or disagree to better establish just where you stand on the issue. So now we're going to look at a sample from a student paper in a previous English 101 class to get some sense of how you can respond to sources in your paper. This sample is from a paper about the expression of fashion that explores whether fashion reflects cultural preferences or the creative output of individual decisions. And this writer has begun to explore this information through a passage from a source. So let's look at this together. She writes, a professor at Cornell University in the Fiber Science and Apparel Design Department, Van Dyke Lewis, researched nature and implications of fashion and shed some light on the debatable meaning of fashion as shown in an article by scholar Meta Winter. And then she presents a lengthy block quote. So what's significant here? We can see that the writer has given us almost 3 lines of an introduction of that source. We know exactly where this information is coming from. We are already inclined to be kind of impressed by the information because we can see it's from a professor at Cornell University in the Fiber Science and Apparel Design Department, so someone who would have a direct stake in this issue and whose research on this issue we would respect. She's also given us some information about the context here. This information is coming from someone who has researched this topic, and so we are then inclined to care about what he or she has to say after having done this research. Another thing that's notable here is that Van Dyke Lewis is actually not the person who wrote the article that this information is from. The article was written by Meta Winter, but because Van Dyke Lewis was quoted directly in that article, this writer wants to cite Lewis directly. So she's done that with a quote of what Lewis said, but we can notice in the in-text citation afterwards, she has said Lewis QTD for quoted in Winter, and then we have the last name of the source and the page numbers it's come from. This is correct for MLA citation. We can also see here that this was a choice the writer made to include a longer block quote. Its 4 lines are longer, so it's been indented 1 inch. The margins are indented 1 inch. And for this longer block quote, there are no quotation marks because the indentation itself is delineating the quote. This we could look at when we read the quote. We can see that this perhaps did need to be maintained in the exact wording of the source because it's coming from the source's own expertise and their own opinion. What follows this, however, is 5 or 6 lines of analysis of that quote, that quoted material. The writer is going on to explain it. She reframes it in another way. According to Lewis, fashion is more than what is established by designers in the runway or in Paris or New York. Rather, clothes constantly interact with technology, media, and culture. Fashion isn't limited to just clothes anymore. It's expanded to many other technological objects that people can have, which also presents a certain style. For example, iPods and cell phones have become as much of an accessory as jewelry or hats. Because of these technological influences, fashion has shifted and adjusted to be compatible with the times. So these ideas and these examples we can see come directly from the quote above. But here the writer's been able to kind of expand and give a practical application of these ideas in context. And all of this discussion and what follows the quote helps us to better understand the material in the quote itself. We can also see that that's not where she ends. The next paragraph takes up the quoted material not just from explaining it, but also now is responding to it. And in fact, we can go on to see that the writer, in fact, is going to go on and disagree with some of the conclusions that Lewis has drawn, although she is going to acknowledge the validity of some of them. She responds, however, though fashion is more than what designers create, they still have a vital role in the process of developing what is in style. So while she's acknowledging that, or she's concluding from her analysis that Lewis questions the central authority of fashion designers and their influence on our fashion choices, she's actually going to go on and disagree with Lewis's point and find that fashion designers may have more influence than Lewis has actually acknowledged in the earlier quote. And we can see that she has her own lengthy response and lengthy analysis that allows her to kind of carve out her own position on this topic. The last thing I want to say about this passage that's notable is look how much time and space this writer has spent now responding to just one single quote. This is a thorough paragraph, essentially, in which the writer has introduced the quote, analyzed the quote, and responded to the quote. And this is just one quote by one source, but it took all of this time and space for her to really make something important out of the material that would earn or merit her spending 4 lines of a quote. Okay, so this has been providing you with an example of how we can put some of these strategies into practice. But if you still have more questions on how you can do this in your own papers, be sure to look at chapters 3, 4, and 5 in They Say, I Say, which actually provides templates for you that can help you both in introducing your sources, but also in responding to your sources and carving out your own position. That can help you, these templates can help you in integrating these sources more seamlessly into your papers. And finally, remember that you can always go to the Writing Center in Tallis Hall for advice specifically on how to weave source material into your writing.